Good day, everyone, and welcome to the 88th session of the Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. The session is available in French and English. You can access your preferred language via the globe icon on the bottom right side of your screen. We are streaming live on the ACA Facebook page and on the ACA YouTube channel, where you could also find the recordings of all past 87 previous sessions. Remember that as the session goes on, you can ask questions and leave comments in the discussion box below. And as usual, we are grateful for our partners and sponsors that are making this webinar possible. The European Union, the Organization African, Caribbean and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the Cashew Club. Kindly be reminded that we have 48 days until the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo from November 18th to 21st of this year in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. We will be discussing around the theme Unlocking Cashew Investment Opportunities for Sustainable Economic Growth. You may visit the ACA website to register. And back to today's session. With our very own Jim Fitzpatrick, we are having updates of the African cashew processing for 2025. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Stella. How are you?
I'm good. Happy to have you back.
It's good to be here. It's good to be again talking cashews. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Today I'm gonna tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story about cashew processing in Africa. Did you know in 2024 there were more cashews processed in African countries than in the entire period of 1990 to 2010 combined? It is a remarkable story. But before we go there, let's have a look at the market. Let's have a look at some of the short-term factors that are influencing the way we're thinking about this market today. First of all, I'm seeing the market now balanced. We've gone from a position of surplus, a little bit of a upward bump early in September, and now it's back to balance in my view. On the one hand, we have factors that might pressurize prices downwards. India is well stocked, strong imports of raw cashew nuts into Vietnam, a large crop forecast in East Africa, weak US imports. We don't know if that's US demand. In fact, we know the imports are weak. We don't really know at this point what consumers are doing. And there are still concerns about economies around the world, particularly in the West. The impact of trade tariffs is a particular concern. On the other side of the scales, what are the factors that might push prices upwards? Well, we've seen that demand is steady. We've seen excellent demand from China, from the Middle East, from Europe, and that's had a major influence on keeping prices this year relatively steady. Costs are high. Costs of raw material, costs of energy, costs of freight, all of these costs are high. Demand in India is also steady, the world's largest market. And we've just heard in the last week that the Tanzanian auction will be delayed until the end of the month. Now that may be significant. It certainly means, as we heard on this event, is it a month ago now? It is. We heard that the crop was going to be a little bit delayed. Francis Alfred told us that. And that looks to have come to fruition. It will also give Tanzanian processors a little bit more time to buy from farmers. So I'm seeing it balanced, but there are a few factors we need to consider in this. I mean, first of all, September, October is a time for budgeting. It's a time for planning, especially in those markets where buyers buy forward positions. So inquiries at this time of year may be just pricing. They may not mean that those buyers are about to make significant buying decisions. We have seen quite a few inquiries, We have seen Vietnamese processors in particular, sensibly, I think, mark their prices up a little bit, perhaps to test the water to see what follow through there is. Fact-wise, we do know that prices remain, as I said, supported by good demand and high costs. We also know that in terms of production and consumption, supply does exceed demand. We live in a time of surplus. But this will take time to impact, and it's not always the case, as we know over the years, that the surplus production actually makes it to the market. Some of that may well carry over into next year. So we're seeing a steady market, relatively well balanced at this time. Not too much reason for volatility. Let's have a look at some of the factors. So what do we look at this time of year if we're trying to make a buying decision? And that is the next move. We know pretty much production for 2025. It's too early sensibly to look forward to 2026. So the next move is with the buyers. And what do buyers look at? They look at the raw cashew nut supply. They look at the processing capacity or the viability of that capacity. They look at consumer trends. They look at the trade in raw cashew nuts, how that's progressing. We know prices are quite high at the moment. They look at the forward contracts. What have they bought? What have their competitors bought? And they look at kernels prices and the chance of volatility in kernels prices in the coming weeks and months. Well, if we look at this, we know that the processing capacity is there. We know that Vietnam is still obviously processing. Maybe there's been one or two cutbacks in some areas, but generally speaking, the capacity is there. And we also know, and we'll talk about it later, that continued processing development in Africa is a major factor. In terms of consumer trends, we've seen, China is the story of 2025, but there are strong trends in most other countries. We're wondering what will be the longer term impact of price rises in the US market, which has shown itself to be influenced by price more than other markets. What's the influence of other snacks? Will consumers look for cheaper snacks? Will they look for different snacks? Will they fall out of love with cashew nuts? I don't think so, but it's possible. What about domestic nuts? What about almonds and pistachios in the United States? These are all major factors. They're not nuts that have import tariffs, obviously. They grow in the US. They are popular, but are they as suitable for snacks as cashews have proven to be in recent years? If we look at the raw cashew nut trade, okay, now it gets complex, and this is complex, this raw cashew nut trade. There are some unsold inventories around, some in West Africa, some with traders, some in warehouses in Vietnam. Costs are high, and regulation has been increasing. And so regulation has been driving costs, higher export taxation, better regulation of the sector, fairer treatment for farmers through minimum pricing regimes. Certainly this is getting more complex and much more difficult to judge than ever before. If we look at the kernels market, and we would hope that the two would reflect each other, but so often they do not. I think we can say that the busy season from a Western point of view, from an Indian point of view, is covered. Nobody really needs to buy any major volumes for 2025. Perhaps for China, for Chinese New Year, early in 2026, there may be some buying still to be done. But buyers will be looking at the prospects for 2026, and that will bring them back to look at the situation in consumer trends, the processing, and what are the unsold inventories of raw cashew nuts. Forward buyers at this time of year can take their time, and they tend to take their time, particularly if there's not a great deal of market volatility around. And they look at the forward contracts and they look at risk. Today, most forward contracts are close to the market price. There may be some a little bit higher, but there'll be very few contracts left that will be below today's market price. So this means that there's a relatively low risk of contract default. Contract default is one of the biggest drivers of volatility in our industry. So what they'll be doing is they'll be looking at new crop, again, encouraging them to wait and see what happens. And they'll be looking at how much RCN is around. And we know that though the trade is volatile, we know India has imported probably, and we don't have the official figures, but probably more than 1 million tons. We know that Vietnam, and these are official figures, has imported 2.3 million tons, 10% up. And we know that there's a record crop in prospect in Tanzania and in Mozambique. In terms of making a buying decision, if I look at that, I think, well, there's no rush. Let's wait. Let's have a look. Once I've got what I need to keep me going through to the end of the year, I might just see how things pan out over the coming weeks. Where are prices? Well, steady. Market's pretty well sold. There have been inquiries and costs, but not much business. So the market's steadied on inquiries and high costs, but not on actual trade. Processors from Vietnam have marked up their prices. Seems like a good move to me. Interestingly, there are inquiries in African countries for kernels, and those inquiries are coming from India. And that is probably illegal trade, but it is having an impact, especially on the price of broken nuts. And this is becoming more and more a factor. But in Africa, most processors are already sold out, in West Africa particularly, less so in East Africa, the crop is just coming, and buyers are looking forward. So the market has steadied up a little bit. African cashew kernels have continued to maintain their premiums. The market is in or around where it was this time last year, no great reason for volatility. If we look at the raw cashew nuts, we see high price to start. Interestingly, talk about resales or reshipment from India to Vietnam. I hear numbers anywhere from 25,000 tons to 75,000 tons. No big problem for India. They have already plenty of RCN on hand. Problem is, generally speaking, if you look at what is becoming available now, that the high-priced raw cashew nuts, whether it be from Indonesia, Tanzania, even from Guinea-Bissau, it doesn't match the current kernels values. And that's an issue. And as I said, there's very little that's encouraging volatility on kernels for now. So this mismatch seems likely to continue. It'll be interesting to see in 4 weeks how that is expressed in the auction in Tanzania and how willing the cooperative unions and the Tanzanian Mercantile Exchange will be to accept what are probably likely to be lower prices than they closed last year's auctions at. Let's have a look then at some of the key factors over the coming weeks. Coming last quarter of the year, it tends to get quieter in a normal year, but it can get very difficult if supply were tight, for example. So we'll have a look at the situation in Vietnam, and this is the way I see it. Opening stock, the crop, we know the imports 2.3 million tons. I'm estimating the imports of Burma kernels at about the equivalent of 200,000 tons of RCN. It could be more. It's a very difficult number to nail down, but that's what I'm talking about for now. We know the exports and the domestic consumption. I think there's about 150,000 tons on the way, some of that from India, as I mentioned. Second half September exports, about 25,000 tons is a fair estimate. That would mean that Vietnam has about 3 months supply. That would give us a balance of about 780,000 tons. That's only 3 months supply, but that's about right for the time of year. Inside that, we look at what would be the export of kernels between October and February when a new crop in Vietnam and Cambodia comes online. It's about 1 million tons. That would mean in order to finish the year with the same modest closing stock as last year, Vietnam only needs about another 440,000 tons. To supply that, there's the Tanzanian crop, Our estimates about 560,000 tons. We're optimistic on processing. That would leave about 530,000 tons for export. That'll only come out during November and December. Mozambique, about 80,000 tons. Indonesia, 60,000 tons of export. And West Africa, between the stock, between what's around, between what's already shipped, about 250,000 tons. So that looks relatively comfortable. Part of the problem for processors, if they want to replace their existing inventories and meet kernels demand, they're relying on high quality, high priced RCN. Difficult decision for them. Until Mozambique comes around, they're either buying older West African material, so that what's left tends to be lower quality, apart from maybe some Guinea-Bissau balances. And then they've got to decide what to do in Tanzania. But Tanzania is not going to hit processors before the second half of December, so we might as well say January. And I think that probably means that they will not be interested in reducing their prices in the last quarter. And I think they'd be right. Inside those figures, we looked at exports. The second half of September exports from Vietnam were really spectacularly good. The first half September exports, I mean, spectacularly good, up 27% on last year, and last year was not a bad year. We are, by the end of August, ahead of 2024, and I think by the end of September, we'll get the figures in the next few days, but by the end of September, we will see that we are going to be even further ahead of the 2024 figure. And as you can see from the chart, 2024 is the record year. So this looks really healthy. It's remarkable. It's remarkable that it happens in a period when the US imports are down. If we just look at that trend, so here's a line chart. So here you have monthly exports from Vietnam, 2022, 23, 24, 25, and just look at the period 9, 10, 11, 12, September, October, November, December. And we see in the past, we've seen a dip in September, probably because China tends to be out of the market at that moment, followed by a spike, and then the market tends to fade away towards the end of the year. Another spike then in January for the Chinese market. It looks to me as if this September dip will not happen. Based on the first half figures and what we hear, this is likely to be up here somewhere, and we're looking at a really healthy export figure for September. That will tighten the inventory position somewhat. It may be later reflected in smaller exports during October, November, December, but for now, the market is likely to remain relatively tight. Let's look at India's situation. So far, again, not an official figure, but on what we understand, it's a record July import. That figure is, the provisional figure is there, it'll be confirmed. January to July, up by 29% in terms of imports on last year. This is starting to look like 2022. Now in 2022, India imported more than 1.3 million tons of raw cashew nuts. And that would tend to point toward a high finishing stock, which in turn will have an influence. Now, it could be that Indian demand is through the roof for the rest of the year. It doesn't look like that. It looks healthy, but not too remarkable. And there has been a little bit of a resale to Vietnam, which is of itself a signal. It could be a lot of things. It could also be foreign exchange speculation or manipulation, but I think probably it's a signal of adequate supplies of raw cashew nuts. If we look at the situation then in India, we see respectable carry-in last year, a little bit less than previous years. That includes work in progress, by the way. A fairly good crop. I'm still thinking 725,000 tons. Some say a little more than that. Some say a little less. 1 million tons imported by September, probably a little more than 1 million tons Exports, domestic demand, we're saying 1.65 million tons. That's a little bit more than last year. That gives us a balance of 225,000 tons. That means India, on paper, is covered. And as we can take out of that 75,000 tons, but if you calculate that Indian demand is roughly the same as last year or a little better, India would be covered. So what we're talking about now is that it's only the increase in Indian demand that needs to be covered for the rest of this year and the period up to February. If imports were to continue at the current rate, it starts to look like 2022. That's why I say deja vu 2022, when the country finished with a very large stock of raw cashew nuts, and that slowed imports in the early part of the following year. That is possible again. I think that could happen again on what we know, and it'll be interesting to see in the coming months how that's adjusted. This has a fundamental impact on what happens in Tanzania from the end of October. That's not to say that there won't be buying, because Tanzanian RCN is always bought because of its quality. But by the end of the auction, where will prices be? How successful will the auction be in moving the material early on? If Indian importers can resist their natural tendency to speculate, we might see RCN prices a little bit more moderate from East Africa this year than they were last year. What about demand in other countries? And now we're kind of starting to focus on what can we expect to see in 2026. First of all, the US. So I did a bit of an analysis of how US demand responds to high prices and to crisis. So what you see with the red bars is percentage movements year on year in imports. So for example, in 2025, January to July, imports were down by 23.34% compared to the same period in 2024. Interestingly, that pretty much matches the increase of 2024 on 2023. The dotted line is the price of WW320's FOB. And this is FOB Vietnam over the years. And what we see is that the American market's response to price volatility is about plus or minus 5% over the years. But when we look at periods of economic volatility, so when we look at 2011, when we look at 2013, which was more a demand-driven situation, 2022, Ukraine and Russia war, big impact of inflation, 2023, similar factors, 2024, the prospect of tariffs, stocking, burgeoning demand. So what we see is in the US is a much different response to crisis. So economic crisis impacts imports more quickly and more heavily than changes in price. 2025 is somewhat different. It's different because we're now talking about import tariffs as an additional factor. So first of all, last year we saw an increase in prices in the high 20s, 27% or thereabouts. That caused imports acceleration because buyers who had low price contracts wanted to get them in as soon as possible. So in some cases they took them earlier. In other cases they negotiated, made averages, shipped them in. There was a prospect of economic turbulence. Demand at retail level was very strong. It was up 7%. That's the highest it's been up for about 20 years. So there were a series of factors that caused US imports to spike last year. And this year, the prospect of tariffs and uncertainty in trade, well, has caused the reaction the other way. So whereas we could say 2025 is a crisis and therefore we would see a recovery next year, we're not really able to say that this year because we do not know the impact of an overall increase in imported food prices in the United States as that starts to hit the supermarkets. And it's only begun to hit the supermarkets in the last month or so. Looking at Europe, altogether more positive picture. So the way Europe moves is the market reacts slowly to price increases. It reacts on the basis of when the price differences are passed on to consumers, how far the forward contracts exist, both between the roasters and the supermarkets, and between the roasters and their suppliers at the origins. But what we also see is a very fast recovery. So when we get a market that dips away, European demand, when it dips away, it tends to recover very quickly. And that fast recovery has been a feature over the last 15 years or so. So in Europe, response to prices in terms of growth is it accelerates or decelerates growth by about 5%. European demand is on a much more speedy growth trend. The growth in the European market is averaging something like 4.8% every year compared to the US. Prior to the volatility of the last 3 years, it was in or around about 1% on average over a 10-year period. Volatile within that, but nonetheless, relatively mature market. Europe's different. Europe is growing more quickly. Western Europe is growing more quickly. Eastern Europe is growing very quickly. Well, let's have a look at the story of 2025. And the story of 2025 when it comes to cashews is what's happened in China. Very fast growth trend. Imports, our shipments this year through the roof, up by over 30% in the first 7 months of the year. I think what we're looking at is a strong growth trend that started some years ago, was interrupted by COVID and by the impact of COVID. That caused growth essentially to disappear for a few years, and then it's returned. From 2023 onwards, we see strong growth. Now, it's happened before. So if we look back to the period 2010 through to 2015, we saw a somewhat similar pattern. We saw very fast growth in the market. Now, at that stage, the market was less than half the size it is today in China, but we saw this fast growth followed by volatility, followed by growth, but not that quick. Now, there's a difference here, and it makes it more difficult to read. And the difference is, of course, 2020, 2022 is COVID. During the pandemic, as you would expect, 2020, effectively no growth, slow growth, and then a slowdown, followed by very fast growth. The question is that likely to continue? On what we see in 2025, the answer would have to be yes, it is likely to continue. But on what we've seen in the past, we know that that's not by any means guaranteed. So if we look at next year, and if we're looking at continuing growth in production, China becomes a critical market, and continued growth in China becomes a critical factor in determining where the market will grow. I wouldn't like to guess on this one, but it seems to me there is a fast growth trend. It probably will continue, but unlikely to continue at the same rate of growth that we've seen this year. What about India, the world's largest market? And if we look at India, we can see steady growth over a long period of time, interrupted during COVID, no surprise there. Varying rates of growth, 2018, 2019, very slow growth, and then we see a pickup post-COVID. As you calculate it, and bear in mind, all of these figures for India are calculated because we do not have any reliable statistics. We have opinions, we have calculations, we have balance sheets, which is what I work with. But if we calculate that, market growing at an average of about 4.6% up to last year, India is a remarkable market. I was in India in March. My eyes were opened. I became very excited about what's happening there in the nut sector. It's becoming more and more segmented. The uses are widespread. I mean, we knew uses were widespread in India, but I was not before March aware of the extension of the use in snacks. Flavored cashews, roasted cashews, all of that to add to traditional cooking, gift packs, sweets that have been there for decades. In recent years, although we've seen, and if we look 2018, 2019, 2017, despite high prices in the international market, we see that Indian growth continued. So the trends, the economic trends, the societal trends tended to overshadow price trends. Probably more people were buying cashews, even though some people, because of higher prices during that period, were buying fewer. As someone said to me back in March, nuts are seen as good, good meaning healthy, tasty, also meaning high status, but they're expensive. That's the consumer's perception. If the consumer changes that perception, nuts are good, healthy, high status, and also good value, then I think we could see Indian demand really take off. And we would see the kind of growth that we haven't seen since the period between 2005 and 2010. India is important. More than 1 in 3 cashews in the world that is consumed in India. If we look forward, project this to 2030, India will be consuming about 450,000 tons of cashew kernels. That's on the current trend. That's about 2 million tons of raw cashew nuts. We need to watch what's happening in India. If India were to return to the growth levels of the 2005 to 2010 period, that 450 could easily become 550,000 tons. Now we start to get really tight supply and demand situation by the end of this decade. So the outlook over the coming weeks, I think raw cashew nut stocks are adequate. Supply exceeds the need, but that doesn't mean that prices will fall. It doesn't mean all of that material will make it to market. Kernels prices look steady. I think buyers will work slowly into 2026. I mean, they have to work within the rules, so they will have to take some cover, but they won't be in any hurry to do so. Good Southern Hemisphere crops will encourage them to wait, but will also supply processors what they need. Demand overall is very strong, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. We are overall looking at a period of booming demand. What could change? Well, a slow start in East Africa could have an impact on that. A slow start means a build-up. For me, raw cashew nut prices now look a little bit vulnerable again. When I say that, I mean they look a little bit high. I think the kernels market remains relatively steady. I think at the current levels, and we're looking, let's say, around 320 to 335 for 320s. Pretty much everyone can live with that. Farmers can live with that. Processors, consumers can live with those kind of prices in this market. Casting our eye forward a little bit into early 2026, I think production still exceeds consumption, but not to the same extent as 2025. I wouldn't expect another record crop next year on what we know. There will be some carry-out inventory to balance that, probably in India, probably a little bit in West Africa too, and certainly some in Vietnam. I think we might see that the processing shift, we'll talk about this shortly, but that the shift to Africa will stall a little bit in 2026. Long term, it will continue in a very positive way, but I think in 2026, it's going to slow down a little bit. The consumption shift toward Asia, towards India, China, other Asian markets will gain momentum. I think it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. 2026 could be a year when we see those moves again. Price is steady for me, but of course, if we get some problem with the crop, or if we get a huge crop, prices will be volatile. That's always been the way. But on what we know today, I think a steady start to the year is likely. And of course, we should always remember that production volatility these days is more likely than it was in the past due to climate change. There's some fairly extreme weather in Cambodia at the moment that can spread, it can last. It doesn't matter an awful lot today, but 2 months from now it could. Elsewhere, similar situations. So we need to understand that production becomes more and more under pressure because of climate change. And that can happen anytime right up to February, March, when the Northern Hemisphere starts to come in. So looking at it now, it looks like a relatively steady, calm period ahead. Very little reason for speculators to grab hold of this market. Not too much reason for concern, but a lot of things to keep an eye on. Interesting times. Well, let's go on then and let's have a look at our story for today. And our story for today is about processing in Africa. It's been a big story in recent years. And as I said, more cashews processed in 1 year, 2024, than in the entire 20 years between 1990 and 2010. It is remarkable progress. But still, African countries remain relatively small processors, particularly in the context of the cashews they produce. About 600,000 tons processed this year, I think, in African countries. Some would say that's a little bit more. I don't quite buy that yet. I don't buy 650,000 tons in Ivory Coast. I don't see it. I don't see the numbers. I don't see that as likely. I do see exports of raw cashew nuts. Nonetheless, despite progress in Africa, between India and Vietnam, 86% of the world's cashew processing took place. And to remind you, in India, mostly for domestic consumption, and in Vietnam, overwhelmingly for re-export. So processing remains highly concentrated despite the progress in African countries. Let's have a look at some of the issues just to set the scene for the discussion of African cashew processing. In India, the big issue is really investment in mechanization and changes in the sector to modernize it. That will mean fewer jobs. We will not see, in the future, we will not see workers like these women sitting on the floor in a factory. That's back in Kerala in 2008. Those days are largely gone from modern factories. Vietnam too has its issues. Tight processing margins, the distance to the supply chain. Importing 3 million tons of raw cashew nuts, 3 million tons plus, some from Cambodia, nearly 1 million tons this year, but most of it from African countries. That's a long supply chain. It's a costly supply chain and it's becoming more and more costly. What about Brazil? Situation is raw material supply. The number of processors has declined in Brazil in line with production. And in Africa, what have we seen in recent years? We've seen the introduction of mechanized processing based on Vietnamese and Indian technology for the most part. But African processing has some big issues still. Big issues around marketing, issues around access to working capital, issues around development of the supply chain. Many processors still don't know who their suppliers are. They buy from traders. They buy the cheapest price, the best quality. The trucks come to their door and they know roughly where it came from, but they've no relationship with those suppliers. And we see issues of poor quality management. So whereas we generally see great quality cashews, there's often issues of management which impact profitability. Those are some of the issues just to set the picture. Now let's have a look and see how African processing has progressed over the years. And I'm going to do that first of all by having a look at African share in the key markets. So first of all, the United States. And if we look on the left, in the green bars, you can see tons. This is tons of cashew kernels imported by the United States from African countries. And it peaked in 2024, 12,500 tons. And broadly speaking, it's been an upward pattern. Market share on the right-hand side, you can see market share over the years. And you can see in some years, despite increased volume, market share actually fell. So today, market share about 7.1% in 2024. First half of 2025, 8.04, not bad. A little bit better than the first half, or the first 7 months rather, of 2024. Positive trend, not particularly major market penetration at this stage. You know, Africa grows 61% of the world's cashews in 2025, but only has an 8% share of the US market. But nonetheless, moving in the right direction. If we look at the volumes, about 12,500 tons of cashew kernels. The volume is growing at about 4.2%. The share is growing at about 2.7%. This is simply because Vietnam's share continues to grow in terms of volume. And finally, if we look at the sources, well, in 2025, Côte d'Ivoire has supplied 4,677 tons of kernels to the United States. That's an increase of 14%, and that's really very positive. But I took Benin and Nigeria as examples, and both are down, significantly down. Benin's down by 25%, January through to July, and Nigeria down by 29%. Neither of these are good signals. We're looking at highly concentrated market share, 80%. 80% of cashew imports from Africa to the United States are from Côte d'Ivoire. So we are looking at a highly concentrated, and that's more concentrated than the actual processing figures, as we'll see. Côte d'Ivoire is the biggest processor by far, with about 63% share, but an even bigger share of the US market. Let's have a look then at the European Union. So in Europe, we're looking at a situation where market share is much higher. Market share of the European market is 3 times that of the United States. Now remember, the European market will be bigger than the US market in 2025. The African share is growing very quickly. It's growing 23% every year. And you can see that in the chart. So this is a volume chart, tons of kernels. And you can see from these very quiet periods, and now we're seeing this exponential growth. There is interest in Europe to buy cashew kernels from African countries. The share is growing at 23%. The volume is growing at 28%. So far in 2025, 22,000 tons supplied. 63% of that is from Côte d'Ivoire. The shocking thing that with this growth, and 2025 looks as if it will be bigger than 2024, with this growth, Mozambique, Benin, Togo, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau have all lost market share in the European market. How can that be? Is there interest in Europe to buy African cashew kernels? Clearly, the numbers tell us yes, there is. Have buyers been putting, as we say here, their money where their mouth is? Obviously they have. We see the volumes growing. We'll talk about why in a few minutes. So let's look then, having looked at the share in the US market, the share in the European market, let's just have a look at actual processing volumes. The volume has up to 2024 accelerated phenomenally. From 100,000 tons processed in 2014 to 551,000 tons processed last year, and it'll be 600, probably 600 plus this year. That's growth of 16% per annum. That's remarkable. How did that come about? Well, if we look back to 2014, we started to see an improved investment environment, better security, better economic conditions. Investors started to look at cashew processing. From 2015 onwards, there was access to large-scale mechanized processing. Now, mechanized processing existed before that, but from 2015 onwards, we started to see the kind of machines that are currently in factories. They've changed somewhat in the last 10 years, but it's the similar process. It became more manageable. It became more easily installed and more easily managed. 2016 to 2018, it was a real boost for the industry that we started to see high kernels prices. Once they kicked in, the incentives started to grow, investors started to look, and then from 2018 onwards, most countries, particularly Cote d'Ivoire, introduced supportive policy. Now, many countries had supportive policy before 2018, but it wasn't directly at the cashew sector. There were tax breaks, there were import incentives, a lack of taxes on the export of kernels, tax breaks for employment, particularly in rural areas. But from 2018 onwards, it became a little bit more cashew focused. At that time also was the idea that sustainable, diversified supply chains were important. And the 2017, 2018 volatility in prices, cashew prices, 320s went to 525 on a monthly basis. They actually traded higher than that. It seems incredible now. That caused buyers to look at their supply chains. Interestingly, not many of them actually invested. They left it to trading companies, they left it to local companies to invest, but the investment started to take place. Ivory Coast led the way. More recently, Nigeria followed. And now we're beginning to see two things in East Africa. We're beginning to see the advent of cashew processing in Tanzania coming back after many years of problems. And we're beginning to see a better processing environment and more positive developments in Mozambique too. So it looks good, it looks positive, we can see why, but it's not without its challenges, as any processor will probably take joy in telling you. It's still challenging and development is uneven. And there's two things that we normally would look at as the macro measures of success in processing. Firstly, how much of the crop is processed? And really nowhere is it getting beyond 29%. And in most countries, it's not even in double digits. So if we look in terms of capacity to process compared to the crop produced, a really positive number today is the 29% of Cote d'Ivoire, close to Benin, close with Togo, both of whom are relatively modest suppliers. But if we look at the second measure, how much of the installed capacity is utilized, we see also problematic numbers. We see numbers that don't lend themselves to profitability. If you're not processing, if you're not using your investment, you have a problem. You're going to lose money. Your costs are going to exceed your revenues. So low capacity utilization, low proportion of the crop processed are still factors. I've mentioned the uneven development. So Cote d'Ivoire, 63% of African cashew processing located in one country. And that's for a range of reasons, sometimes to do with government policy, sometimes to do with government incentives, but also to do with supply chain and other factors. I'll talk about those in a moment. Big factor that's right across all countries is poor access to working capital. That means that financial institutions still see cashew processing as a risky business. They still see themselves needing additional security over and above the stock, over and above the contracts, unlike the situations in India or in Vietnam, where those two things are enough to secure financing. And we haven't even mentioned the cost of it. So within that, there's a few problems. The problem of not being able to present the case well, the problem that simply for banks, it's easier to finance RCN trade. Lend the money, turn it over 3 or 4 times a year. You've got the stock, you've got the documents. It's an easier process. And apparently it's less risky. It isn't less risky. It can be nightmarish. But the current profile is that it's less risky. And this factor of uneven development, well, you can see it. If we look at this chart, is right across the countries, most of the countries of the cashew sector in Africa. We look at the installed capacity, that's the blue. We look at what was processed 2023, 2024, gray and blue, and then a processing estimate for 2025. And what we see is that no country is getting anywhere close to its ability to process. And that's a problem. If you're not using your assets, if you're not using your assets to service the debt, you're going to be in problems. You're not going to make money. And that is a serious factor for many cashew processors. Now, what we also see is some doing very well. Some with costs under control and good marketing and good management really doing very well. I think there's a few factors here, and I think that these factors have made this situation worse. We talked about processing in Africa. We talked about European market share, United States market share, but the biggest buyer of African cashew kernels is, it's Vietnam in 2024. 44% of the exports were Burma kernels. So if we look at markets, if we look at the European market by value, it's the biggest market. But if we look by volume, Vietnam was the biggest market. I think this trade, known as Burma kernels, is a short-term trader answer to the problem. Impatient investors wanting to turn money over quickly, not understanding the long-term opportunity, they tend to address the symptom. The symptom is you're early stage in business. It takes years to get going. It takes time to make money. But when you get there, it can be very successful. This is not the disease. It's just a symptom. Addressing this by going into the Burma kernels trade damages the investment profile, damages the brand, if we want to call it the brand, of African cashews. And it sends a negative message to buyers of cashew kernels and to investors. So the Burma kernels trade has made some people money, but for most countries, it's been negative, in my opinion. Now, some people are doing something about this. Mozambique, starting next year, will tax the export of Burma kernels with the agreement of processors. And Cote d'Ivoire, earlier this year, the CCA told us that they will stop subsidizing the export of Burma kernels. Of course, within 4 years, they'll stop subsidizing all processing. That's a major factor. And this idea of addressing the symptom, not trying to build the strength of the patient, is a problem. But there are also other problems, and these are more fundamental problems in the sector. There are problems of market environment. If we take Ghana, for example. So in Ghana, you get very high priced raw cashew nuts early in the season. You get a lot of traders, often from abroad, trying to buy high quality raw cashews early in the season, mainly for India. Low export taxes, the lowest export taxes of any country that actually levies either a levy or a tax is in Ghana. Nigeria has none, but Ghana has, I think it's a levy of something like $7 a ton. and slow development of policy. So it's clear in Ghana the policy is to develop the sector, add value. How that's going to be done, we don't know. When it's going to be done, we don't know. We think it is going to be done. Meantime, investors are building factories elsewhere. And it's interesting in Ghana because this problem of early season scramble for raw cashew nuts has meant that Ghana, which was the most favored destination for cashew processing investment 10 years ago, has virtually seen no investment in the last 10 years. There was one factory built, and that wasn't even built for commercial reasons. If you look in Guinea-Bissau, well, we know the problems of the cross-border trade and politics and risk. This makes investment difficult. We know in Benin, which again has the problem of, I mean, this is where sometimes your competitive advantages can also be your problems. So Benin is high demand raw cashew nuts. And for years, it was difficult for processors to compete with that. Now, when we look at it, we see a situation where the export of raw cashew nuts is not allowed, but it still continues. And it continues illegally. And that is obviously a major problem. We've got a regulatory system that doesn't work. It's not effective. Perhaps it was overambitious. Obviously, this is my personal opinion, but what we're seeing is actually processing with excellent factories, excellent capacity, is not doing what it should be doing. Those are facts. In Mozambique, the supply chain can be difficult. The seasonality, the quality of the raw cashew nuts, the supply chain complexity, and in some areas, security are all issues, and processors have struggled. And in Tanzania, again, so Tanzania is now, I think, on the cusp of a major change, still a relatively low processor. Commercial factories last year, for me, about 14,000 tons. Small factories, more than that. But let's say export-oriented factories, 14,000 tons. That might hopefully rise above 20,000 tons this year. Again, high cost raw cashew nuts, up to 2 years ago, having to work within the auction. Some difficulties last year, but it looks now as if the cashew board has again resolved to allow processors access to the local marketing, agricultural marketing co-ops, which is really good news for processing and probably for farmers too. And some of these issues may disappear. But these are largely organizational, regulatory, infrastructure problems that make processing difficult. And all of those problems, I think, can be solved. The biggest problem is, and without going on too much about it, the biggest problem remains the access to working capital, particularly for domestically owned factories. And it's not just supply chain, it's also policy. Two things about policy, in my opinion. Firstly, is there's a copycat thing going on right across Africa. Because they do it, we'll do it. Because it worked for them, it should work for us. But actually, what we need to look at is what's the best policy for our situation, our country. And also, can we implement it? If we ban the export of raw cashew nuts, can we actually enforce that? If we cannot, why do it? If we cannot, you end up simply criminalizing a lot of trade unnecessarily. So the ban on RCN exports has not worked in any of the 3 countries that have tried it, either temporarily or permanently. We see a certain volatility in policy. We see poor communication in policy. We see ideas not quickly enough turned into realities. We see good initiatives, for example, in Ghana, export licensing, registration of actors, but then we're waiting for the next step forward, which is understandable. These things take time. But in the meantime, investors start to look elsewhere. And allied to that, we have this significant problem of communication and messaging right across the cashew sector. And it's not only in Africa, of course, but we get what I call them just misfires. And it's all too easy in the era of social media for this to happen. On the one side, you get unintended consequences, misinformed messaging, claiming credit for things you didn't do, negotiating through the news media. On the one hand, it's these messaging misfires, and you can see plenty of examples on the screen. On the other hand, we have the problem of the misinformation in order to gain influence or to influence the market or to change the price on a given day. I've got a warehouse full of cashews. I'm going to put out a message that says something that helps me sell them. Poor research, lack of data, lack of analysis. These are all problems for all of us right across the sector. Either it's an overly positive story that really doesn't exist, or it's an overly negative story, but all of this damages investors' confidence. What do banks think when they see Ghana's largest cashew processor set to relocate to Ivory Coast? Never going to happen. We don't need to communicate in that way. We've heard the dark side of the cashew industry based on research that's 20 years old. Go to a modern cashew factory, see how it works, then tell your story. So this kind of messaging, I think, is destructive, and we need to address it. We need to communicate better, and we need to base our communication on good data. If we look at competitiveness, and when we look at African cashew factories, I put a lot of information on this slide because we've talked about this before, but I wanted to touch on it because it's the essence of the competitiveness of African cashew factories, which has been recognized by many buyers, particularly in Europe. African cashew factories tend to be modern, they tend to be mechanized, they tend to be large scale. They're well located. You know, if we look at this, it's an old story, but it's a true story. This journey of raw cashew nuts to Asia and the kernels back to the market of Europe, I took in this example, 7.5 times shorter to buy in West Africa and ship to Europe. So we're looking at reduced distance traveled, which means a reduced carbon footprint. We're looking at less handling operations, 70% less handling of the raw cashew nuts in a direct chain than in this indirect chain. Now, in the past, this chain was based on the absence of alternative. There was no processing of any consequence in African countries. Where it existed, it was high cost. That's changed. Now it's mechanized. There's no need for this chain anymore. Well, there is need because we don't have capacity yet, but there's no absolute need for this system to exist with investment. So when we look at aspects of the sector now, what we can see is transition. We see not only the advantages of a more sustainable supply chain through location, but also advantages of location in terms of lower freight, in terms of shorter lead times, in terms of buyers needing less inventory because their suppliers are closer to hand, longer shelf life, and fresher kernels. And if you think about it, in the typical supply chain that we operate in today, the kernels, by the time they reach the supermarket, are a minimum of 6 months old. Many of us in Europe have never tasted a fresh cashew kernel. And that means something. And when you do taste one, you recognize what it means. We're also in West Africa, traceability is more likely. It's impossible to offer full traceability in the current supply situation via Vietnam, for example. And of course, if we look at the incoming and developing law around impact and responsible sourcing, particularly under European law, it really means sourcing directly in the origins where the products grow. That's the only way you can actually meet all of the requirements of the law, not as it is today, but as it is foreseen in the future. So when we look at competitiveness of African cashew processing, it's based on mechanization, it's based on supply chain, and it's based on location. That is how African cashew processors are competitive. If we look purely at processing costs, and you can see it across a range going from a small scale manual factory through various countries and scales all the way to the largest, lowest cost, large scale factories of Vietnam. And what we see is, generally speaking, the new African factories have higher costs of processing per ton. So this is per ton of raw cashew nuts. But of course, they've much lower cost in their supply chain. They've much lower cost of buying the product from farmers and bringing it to the factories for processing. And this is a combination of factors. It's a combination of the number of people in the chain, the number of margin takers in the chain. It's a combination of that with freight costs, export taxation, and import and handling costs at the far end. If you just think of what I was saying earlier, that 70% fewer physical handling operations take place in a direct buy it from the farmer, process it at origin, export it, then in the chain that leads through to export to Vietnam or to India. So we add the two together and we start to see at that point that in terms of Vietnamese factories processing African RCN, now not processing Cambodian RCN because that's much closer to hand, but processing African RCN, we start to see that it's possible to be competitive on price. Even in well-developed, sustainable, and that means certified supply chains, costs can be competitive. This competitiveness, and this is only to the FOB basis, combined with freight advantages, lead time advantages, quality advantages, traceability, and responsible sourcing advantages, give African cashew kernels competitiveness. That's why today, in many cases, buyers are prepared to pay premium prices for cashew kernels from West Africa compared to the product that they could easily source in Vietnam. So the outlook for African cashew processing, as I see it, continued growth based on these factors, based on development of the supply chain and location, nearness to the supply chain, but also on the quality of the cashew kernels. And for African cashew processors, producing a good quality kernel is essential. Location in terms of where the buyers are. So which markets do you focus on? If you're in West Africa, it's pretty clear you should be focusing on North America or Europe. And the figures show us that that's what's happening. If you're in East Africa, well, you have a choice. You may well decide that the markets of the Middle East or Central Asia or further east are better markets for you. Second factor is the continued volatility of regulation of the sectors and policy development is creating challenges and is likely to continue to create challenges, including creating a risk profile that makes it less likely that financial institutions will want to offer working capital to cashew factories. Therefore, we're going to see some rationalization. We're going to see some next year, the year after, based on changes in policy and regulation, based on market volatility, we will see some of the factories that were established based on their management capacity or lack of it, poor marketing, lack of access to working capital, and an end of supports, particularly subsidies in Cote d'Ivoire, but others too, we will see that there will be a rationalization in the sector. That doesn't necessarily mean less processing. It probably means a concentration of processing in those factories that have been successful so far. Longer term, I think we will see a change in the type of investor in the industry. And this will, in my opinion, change the character of the industry as we go forward. And that will mean a greater engagement of food businesses, either domestic or international, in processing and in supply chain development, and fewer traders. That'll change our culture, that'll change our way of doing business, and that will probably change the attitude of banks to this industry. That's my story on African cashew processing as we stand. It's a really positive story. Not without its challenges, but I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. When I first came into this business, the idea of processing cashews in Africa had disappeared. It was gone from the 1970s, when Africa was the major processor, East Africa. Processing had disappeared, and we were dreaming that it might return to Africa. That's happened. It's on its way. We're looking forward to the next chapter. Stella, back to you if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Jim. Yes, I have a couple of questions here for you. How prepared are African cashew processors to meet the EU's evolving responsible sourcing and deforestation-free requirements?
First of all, cashews are not covered by deforestation legislation at the moment. But in terms of responsible sourcing, which unfortunately this legislation has been watered down from its original intention, are they ready? Well, if you look at the world trade picture, it is only African cashew processors, or let's put that differently, it's only origin-based cashew processors that can meet the requirements. The current international raw cashew nut chain is not suitable for purpose when it comes to responsible sourcing. So my view is, not only are they ready, even though they may not know they're ready, because they don't speak the language of responsible sourcing, they don't market well, some of them. I think it's our only option for responsible sourcing in the long term. Now, when I say that, that's about 61% of world production. But similar would apply to Vietnamese cashews grown in Vietnam, Cambodian cashews grown in Cambodia, Indian cashews grown in India, or Brazilian cashews grown in Brazil, Indonesia too. So what I'm thinking is that responsible sourcing means origin-based processing, wherever that might be. Stella?
Jim, back to Cote d'Ivoire with the challenges related to the subsidies. How do you think that local processors could adapt in the future?
I think that some processors may have developed a dependence on subsidies. They've had a year to get used to the idea that they're not receiving that cash. And the subsidies will be phased out over the next 4 years, according to the latest information that we have. I think that the situation is likely to mean a certain amount of rationalization. If I were to look at this and how can we improve our operations, I'd say the failings are in two areas. One is the development of the linkages to the farmers and the development of the supply chain and the understanding of what cashews mean to farmers and how to deal with that supply. And the other side is to improve marketing, to understand the markets better, to understand each factory, to understand its own competitive advantages, and to look for customers that are interested in taking advantage of those factors. And so really develop the supply chain, build the marketing capacity. If as much time were spent on doing that as is spent on discussing subsidies with the government, we probably would be further forward today. Stella?
Thank you, Jim. In the comment section, someone is referring to the reliability of raw cashew nuts. How do they have access to, should I say, reliable contacts for that?
Reliable contacts for buying raw cashew nuts.
Yes, I think that's what the question is about.
Okay. Go to the African countries, meet the suppliers, develop relationships. That's how you do it. How would you buy anything?
Another question, what is Cote d'Ivoire doing right that the East African countries didn't do back in the days that caused challenges with processing?
Well, I would not like to make that comparison because in the past, in the 1990s, there was no mechanized processing. The development of a processing unit might have needed the training of 3 to 5,000 people. There were different times, different challenges. I think in Cote d'Ivoire, what they have done really well is they've taken advantage of the development of processing technology. They have allowed the free import of that material. They've allowed the import of the people to manage those factories. They have allowed investment. They subsidized short term, that's coming to an end. They resisted the temptation to tax the export of cashew kernels. And generally speaking, we have to recognize that this has been a remarkable upward trend in that country in cashew processing. It leads Africa, and it's although a long way behind the other major processing countries, a long way behind, it still is the third in the world. So I think that East African countries can look at what's happened in Cote d'Ivoire and look at the use of technology, the ability to import machines freely, the free movement of capital, the opportunity to repatriate profits, um, not tinkering with the supply chain too much, avoiding, and we've seen that there have been issues in Cote d'Ivoire at times where really the, how am I going to put this, short-term adjustments to the supply chain regulation have caused problems and have been unnecessary. But I think also a key thing is to give processors an opportunity to buy from farmers and to encourage those linkages and to give those processors a period, a window, if you like, in which they can deal with farmers. I think a lot of those things are there. You need to look at not only processing, you need to look at supply chain, you need to look at improving quality if possible. You need to look at access to working capital. I would also suggest the type of investor. Any country looking to encourage investment in cashew processing should not only be looking at, the basics of getting a factory built, but should also be looking at what kind of investors do we want? What is the impact of different kinds of investors, and thinking long term. So this, you don't build an industry in a year or two. It takes many years. And partners who are prepared to commit for the long term are important. Stella.
Jim, regarding the volatility of regulations and policies and the challenges that these creates, what would be your advice for the countries that are currently having the ban, Burkina Faso, Benin, and Kenya?
My advice would be to engage with the stakeholders, consider the impact of the bans overall over the long period, consider the impact on not only on processors but also on farmers, consider the impact of, to a certain extent, making some of the trade illegal. And I find that it's very much a personal opinion, by the way, but I find the idea that some people are forced to trade illegally as negative for the overall prospects for the sector. I think it's important to recognize that there are no easy fixes, that bans, broad, wide scale bans bans on export of a product when you don't have the capacity either to enforce the ban or to process that product can be negative. And I think especially the impact on farmers has to be considered. And at the end of all of this, we don't have any processors without farmers. We don't have any cashew nuts without farmers. And they need to be properly looked after, and they need to feel that they're part of the system. If you can get actors to agree on how the system goes forward, then it becomes much easier to enforce. But if you overregulate or if you create regulations, and we've seen this all over the world, not least in Europe in the past, it's an incentive to break the rules. The more rules you have, the more angles people are looking for. So I think engage with stakeholders, learn from other countries, consider the ability to enforce the ban, and consider the impact of the ban. These are the key things in reassessing the success or otherwise of the policy. Stella.
By when can we expect Africa's cashew processing industry to surpass that of India and Vietnam?
How long is a piece of string? No one knows the answer to that question. What I can say is that we can expect to see continued growth. It won't be straight line growth. It'll be one step, two steps forward, one step back, perhaps at times. But I think it will continue to grow. And I think that the percentage of the crop that's processed will increase, but also the crop will increase. So that's not necessarily a perfect measure. I think the raw cashew nut export to India will continue for the long-term future because those cashew nuts are consumed in India, as long as the Indian market is not amenable to the import of cashew kernels. And I think also in Vietnam. We've spoken the positive sides of African processing, but there's still a long way to go, and Vietnam has a huge role to play in cashew processing. And perhaps a positive step in the meantime would be to build better direct supply chain links between Vietnamese processors and African growers. But it's a long way away, let's put it like that. But progress is going to continue, in my view.
Thank you very much, Jim. What should we expect during the next webinar on October 15th?
Well, in 2 weeks, we're going to have a look at the Southern Hemisphere crops. That means Brazil, Indonesia, Tanzania, Mozambique. We're going to have a look at how those crops are progressing, what they mean in terms of the overall supply, and how they'll influence the perspective for the marketing year 2026. That's in 2 weeks. That will be the 89th of these webinars, and you will find from today or tomorrow all 88 editions online on the African Cashew Alliance channel. So look them up. You don't watch them all, please. But pick out some subjects that might interest you. And if you do want to talk cashews, there's my email address and my number on the screen. Feel free, and I'll try and get back to you at some stage. But for now, thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. Thanks, Stella. Great job as usual. And I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you very much, Jim. We will see you in 2 weeks. And we also want to say thank you to our partners and sponsors that are making this webinar possible. The European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nut Initiative, and the Cashew Club. As Jim has mentioned, all Global Market Encounter sessions with Jim Fitzpatrick are available on the ACA YouTube channel at African Cashew A, and you can watch all 88 recording sessions all time. Mark your calendars, the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo is taking place from November 18th to 21st of this year at GNEC in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and all roads will lead to Tanzania this November. Until the next 2 weeks, enjoy the 30 minutes networking session before the end of the session. Bye.
En Afrique et en Asie, augmenter la compétitivité des produits finis tout en réduisant la facture énergétique grâce à la valorisation de biomasse représente un enjeu économique majeur pour les pays, tant pour maximiser la valeur ajoutée nationale qu'en matière de création d'emplois. Ces industries peuvent par exemple concerner la transformation de la noix de cajou, du riz ou encore du bois. Néanmoins, la gestion des résidus de transformation et l'approvisionnement en électricité peuvent s'avérer compliqués et coûteux pour les industriels. Le projet AgroGazélec, appuyé par le Fonds français pour l'environnement mondial, a pour vocation de les valoriser en les transformant en électricité au sein même des agro-industries. S'ils sont gérés de manière durable, ces résidus deviennent une opportunité pour ces entreprises. Leur facture d'électricité est effacée et ils peuvent également bénéficier de revenus complémentaires avec la revente de biocharbon ou de l'excédent d'électricité sur le réseau électrique. L'objectif du programme est de développer une solution viable pour la valorisation des résidus agricoles et agro-industriels à travers leur gazéification et la production d'électricité dans des groupes électrogènes adaptés. De par sa modularité, cette technologie est adaptée pour des puissances entre 100 kW et 2 MW électriques. Cela passe notamment par la capitalisation d'expériences précédentes au Cambodge où IED Invest opère ce type de centrale depuis 2011 afin de transférer cette technologie ainsi que sa fabrication en Afrique de l'Ouest. La réalisation de projets pilotes permettra de mettre l'accent sur l'appropriation locale à travers de la formation et de répliquer ce modèle dans la sous-région, que ce soit à partir de coques d'anacarde, de balles de riz ou de résidus issus de la transformation du bois par exemple. Le programme AgroGazelec favorisera ainsi le développement du tissu économique local, la transition énergétique ainsi que la protection de l'environnement.
MEA was founded in 1993 and listed on the air share market in 2012. MEA is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. MEA is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. MEA brand new cashew color sorter equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of